Wyoming Territory. 1,883, the Wind River Range. 1 hour's hard ride below the summit. The horse slipped. Rock gave way beneath the hooves. Clara Whitfield hit the cliff face with her full-weight left shoulder first, before she could make a sound. Then he was already there. Cole Maddox dropped to his knees in front of her, his mountain-worn hands moving across her shoulder, with the kind of certainty that doesn't come from books. Not broken, just shifted. I can put it back, but it's going to hurt. She looked straight up at him. The one man in Redemption Creek she had never allowed herself to trust. Do it. Breathe in. The pain hit like a lightning strike sharp. Brutal, absolute. She seized his sleeve with her right hand. Pressed her lips together. Didn't make a sound. He held position. Steady as the mountain behind her. Waiting until her breathing evened out. Then she whispered, her voice eerily calm, like she was taking notes on someone else's injury. It hurts, but I trust you. He wasn't looking at her shoulder anymore. He was looking at her face. And his hand, it didn't move. Not yet. Not for a few seconds longer than it had any reason to stay. The mail stage rolled into the valley at dusk, and Clara Whitfield had been awake for 31 hours. She knew the exact number. Force of habit. Doctors track duration the way other people track money carefully, because it matters. Her father's leather bag sat on her lap. Both hands rested on it. She was not gripping it. She was not afraid. She was simply waiting for the next thing to happen. The way she had learned to wait in the receiving wards of Boston hospitals that did not officially acknowledge she worked there. Wyoming came through the window in pieces. The Wind River Range rose to the west, like something that had been there before the continent finished forming, and had no particular opinion about human beings. The grass was dry and pale. The air was thin enough to notice. And the space, the sheer, unliterary scale of the space, was something no newspaper dispatch had prepared her for. 2 other passengers shared the stage. Briggs, a supply merchant who had fallen asleep outside Laramie and had not stirred since, and Mrs. Foss, a woman of about 50, who had been knitting with intense concentration since Fort Steele, as if the needles were more interesting than the landscape. Mrs. Foss had read Clara's name off her luggage tag 20 miles back. She had been deciding whether to ask ever since. She finally asked. Clara answered plainly. "Physician, Mrs." Foss said. "Oh, how interesting." In the particular tone that means exactly the opposite. Clara had heard that tone 14 times in the past year, once for each hospital in Boston that had reviewed her file and declined. The most honest rejection had come from Massachusetts General. The department chief set her file down without opening it. He said, without looking up, "We don't question your qualifications. Miss Whitfield, the question is whether patients will extend the necessary confidence to a female practitioner," she had answered. "Then the deficit you're describing lives in your waiting room." "Sir, not in mine." She stood, picked up her bag, and walked out. That was 6 weeks ago. What brought her here was not that conversation. It was a letter from a woman named Agnes Bright, and one sentence near the end written in plain, deliberate handwriting. 3 children died here last year because there was no one to treat them. I don't need you to have a title. I need you to show up. Clara had shown up. The front wheel struck a buried rock on the grade into the valley. The axle shifted but held. Carol, the driver, climbed down, looked at it, and announced they needed an hour to reseat it. Briggs woke up long enough to complain. Mrs. Foss kept knitting. Clara stepped out. Pine forest on both sides. Going dark in the early evening. Cool air, the smell of resin and dry earth. Nothing remarkable about any of it. Then she heard it. Low and controlled. Someone managing pain in private. The way people do when they don't want to be found. She picked up the medical bag and walked toward the sound without asking anyone. He was in the tree line. A crow man, around 30, sitting against a fallen log. His left lower leg was fractured. She could see the break through the torn trouser fabric. Clean, not compound. He had been biting his own forearm to stay quiet, and he looked at her the way a person looks when they have decided not to ask for help. And help has shown up anyway. She set the bag down and opened it. She did not touch him first. She showed him with her hands, with her face, with the slow, deliberate pace of her voice, exactly what she was about to do. Step by step before she did any of it, not because of protocol, because this man had the right to know what was happening to his own body. He had the right to say no. She was going to make sure he understood that. He could not speak much English. She could not speak Crow. They managed. Carol appeared at the tree line and said, "Leave the Indian be. We're burning daylight." Clara did not look up, she said. "You can fix the wheel. I'll finish when I'm finished." That was all. She went back to the splint. Hoofbeats came from the north. A gray horse, broad-backed and steady. A man who sat it, the way people sit things they have been doing since, before they were conscious of learning. He saw the scene and said nothing for 5 full seconds. Then he dismounted, tied the horse, and crouched beside the injured man. He spoke to him in Crow, a few sentences. The man answered. The rider looked at Clara. "He asks whether you know what you're doing." Clara, without pausing. "Tell him I'll take instruction if he has a better method." The injured man heard the translation. He almost smiled. The rider picked up her lantern and held it at the angle she needed. He did not ask whether she wanted him to. He just saw what was needed and did it. When the work was done, and she finally looked at him properly, she noticed. He had never offered his name. He had offered the light instead. "Thank you for the lantern," she said. "You're the doctor," he said, "not a question." "They've contracted me as a nurse." "A beat. I'm a doctor," she said. He looked at her, then at the man on the ground. Then he said something in Crow she could not follow. She would find out later what it meant. It translated to, "This woman's hands know what they're doing." His name was Cole Maddox. She would learn that later, too. He helped get the injured man onto his horse and walked the animal north toward the Crow settlement, while Clara rode the stage the last mile into Redemption Creek. The town was smaller than she had pictured. Lantern lit, a saloon with a piano, a white church at the far end, a land office with its window still burning, even at this hour. She made a note of that window. At the boarding house, a man was waiting in the entry, as if by coincidence, silver at his temples, a handshake calibrated to say "I matter" without saying it outright. He introduced himself with the ease of a man who had never once needed to justify his own importance. "Miss Whitfield, this town needs healing hands." A pause one beat too long. "Whether those hands belong to a physician or a nurse. Redemption Creek will have whatever I'm able to give it." "Mr. Drummond," she said. After he went upstairs, she stood in the empty entry and thought about the word healing in his mouth. The particular way a man uses a word to mean something narrower than its definition. She went up to her room and opened the window. The land office across the street was still lit, and Cole Maddox was standing at the corner below, not looking at her window, looking at that light. His expression was not idle. It was the face of a man measuring something from a careful distance. She watched him watching it until the lamp in the land office finally went dark. Only then did he turn and walk away. He did not look up at her window. He did not need to. Clara closed the window. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened her father's bag. She checked the supplies by feel, the way she did every night. Quinine, suture thread, the bone saw she hoped she would not need. Outside, Redemption Creek settled into its nighttime quiet. She had the feeling it would not stay quiet long. Clara was up at 5, old habit from Boston. The ward rounds started at 6, and she was never officially on the schedule. But she went anyway. She would stand in the back and watch the attending physicians work, and take notes in the small leather book she kept in her coat pocket. Nobody asked her to leave. Nobody acknowledged she was there either. She existed in that particular in-between space that institutions create for people they benefit from but don't want to name. She sat at the writing table in her room and opened her father's medical bag. Inventory was the first thing she did every morning. Quinine getting low, clean alcohol, adequate for now. 2 grades of suture thread. The prescription notebook with E. Whitfield, MD, embossed on the cover. She had started using it anyway. The name wasn't hers, but the work was. and she figured that counted for something. Redemption Creek in daylight was a different place than it had been at dusk, smaller than she'd expected, but alive. The blacksmith was already hammering. She could hear it from her window, that steady, purposeful sound that meant someone had been up before her. She liked that. She walked down to the main street before clinic hours. The air was cool and sharp, the kind of air that made you take a deeper breath than you meant to. She passed a bakery 2 doors down from the boarding house, hand-lettered sign in English. Sung Family Provisions below it, Chinese characters she couldn't read. She stopped and looked at both. It was a small thing. But she noticed that they didn't match. The English said one name, and the Chinese said something else entirely. A family choosing what to show depending on who was reading. She filed that away. It seemed important, though she couldn't have said exactly why. The space assigned to her was the room behind the church. Reverend Hale had swept it and left a fresh candle on the table. It smelled of old wood and cold ash from the stove, but the light was decent and there was room to work. She hung her father's bag on the nail by the door and arranged the table the way she liked it. 3 people were waiting when she arrived at 7. The first was a girl named Lily Sung, 7 years old, 3 days of fever with stomach cramping. Her mother, May, carried her in with the expression of a woman who had run completely out of patience for institutions and had decided to try one more thing before giving up entirely. May spoke very little English. Clara spoke no Mandarin. This presented a problem that Clara solved the only way she knew how: slowly, carefully, with a lot of gesture and a willingness to be wrong and try again. Before she touched the child, she stopped. She showed May on her own arm, demonstrating each movement first, exactly what she was going to do. Press here, check here, listen here. May watched. Her expression shifted in a way that was hard to name but easy to recognize. Something that had been braced began, very slightly, to unbrace. The diagnosis was straightforward: mild intestinal infection, treatable with rest, clean water, and a simple preparation that Clara wrote out in careful detail so May could reference it without coming back every day. She handed the paper to May and waited while the woman looked at it. May said something in Mandarin. Clara didn't understand the words. She understood the tone. The second and third patients were a farmer with a badly set wrist and an elderly man with fluid in his lungs. The wrist she could help with. The lungs were going to require ongoing attention. She was closing her notes when James Sung came in. He was 40 years old, deliberate in the way he moved and the way he spoke, with the particular dignity of a man who has spent years being underestimated and has decided it will not cost him anything. His English was good, better than good, the kind of English that comes from necessity rather than school. He said his wife told him what happened at the examination. She said you explained what you were going to do before you did it, he said. She said the doctor last year just grabbed Lily's stomach to check it, didn't say anything first. Like checking a melon at the market. Clara thought about that for a moment. A patient isn't a subject, she said. She's a partner in her own treatment. That's the first thing they taught us in medical school. James Sung looked at her steadily. People don't think that way around here. Then maybe that's part of why I'm here. He thanked her and left. He didn't offer anything else. She noticed he was watching her. She understood that and let it be. Some trust has to be earned before it can be given. That is simply the truth. And pushing against it doesn't change it. Agnes Bright arrived after clinic hours. She didn't knock. She pushed the door open, looked around the room with the quick, assessing eye of someone who evaluates spaces the way a farmer evaluates soil, and sat down. You saw the Sun girl first this morning, she said. Not a question. Child was sick, Clara said. Of course. Agnes looked at her for a moment. I know who you are. I read about the Women's Medical College 3 years ago. Some newspaper piece about medical education. You're not a nurse. You're the best trained physician who's agreed to come to this valley in a decade, maybe longer. Clara said nothing. She waited. Agnes told her about Robert, her husband, dead 2 years. The official finding was rotted timber in the horse barn roof. Agnes had examined the timber herself because her father was a carpenter and she had grown up learning how wood fails and how it doesn't. The cuts she found in the structural beam didn't come from rot. They came from a saw. She had told 5 people this. Not one of them had believed her. Or if they did, they had decided believing her was more trouble than it was worth. "I'm telling you because you're an outsider," Agnes said, "and because you saw Lily sung first. You can't be bought." Clara listened to all of it. She didn't say she believed it. She didn't say she didn't. She just listened the way she listened to patients describing symptoms, looking for the shape of what was real underneath the words. "I appreciate you telling me," she said. Agnes nodded once and stood up. No warmth in it, but no coldness either. It was directness. Clara had learned to recognize the difference. The welcome gathering was at the land office, not the church, not the courthouse. The land office, which told her something about where power actually lived in this town. Drummond had arranged it, and Drummond's name was on the building that held it. 12 men, no women except Clara. She was introduced around the room. Hank Corbin, a farmer who shook her hand too hard and let go too fast, the way men do when they're nervous about something. Ray Sutter from the land office, who managed to look at the space just to the left of her face for the entire introduction. Marshal Brent Ives, who leaned against the wall and did not extend his hand at all, and Deputy Eli Cobb Young, from Tennessee by the sound of him, who looked at her with genuine curiosity. The only one in the room who actually seemed to see her. The Reyes family stood near the door. They had come, but no one had officially invited them, and they seemed to understand this. Drummond spoke about health and community, and the territory's future. It sounded very good. Clara listened and noted what was missing. He named no Chinese residents. He named no members of the Crow Nation. He spoke about Redemption Creek, as if it contained only the people in this room. She let him finish. Then she stood up and said, "Thank you for the welcome. Before we go further, I want to be clear about something for the record. My clinic serves all the residents of this valley, the Chinese community, the Crow Nation settlement to the north. Everyone. Does the council confirm that arrangement?" Silence. Drummond smiled. It reached every part of his face except his eyes. "Of course, Miss Whitfield. We care for all our people." Ives did not move. Ray Sutter looked at the floor. Hank Corbin looked at Drummond, looked at Clara, looked at Drummond again. Doing a calculation she couldn't fully read. She smiled back. She had just made Drummond say yes in front of witnesses. If he interfered with her treating the Crow or the Chinese community later, he would be contradicting his own public word. It wasn't much, but it was something she could point to. That afternoon, she was restocking supplies when Mrs. Reed stopped by with extra lamp oil. They talked for a few minutes about nothing in particular, the way you do when you're still figuring out whether you trust someone. Clara asked, casually, whether Drummond had family in the valley. Mrs. Reed's face did something. Something small and quick that she controlled before it went too far. Had a wife, Eleanor, left about 12 years ago now. A pause. People said she couldn't take the winters. Cold up here. The way she said it made it clear that the cold she meant had nothing to do with weather. Clara filed it away. Eleanor, 12 years gone. And Mrs. Reed still didn't want to stay on the subject. After dark, Cole Maddox stood across from the clinic watching the land office window 2 doors down. The clinic was in his line of sight. He told himself he was watching the land office, which was true, as far as it went. He had heard what she did at the town council meeting. Redemption Creek was small enough that news moved by the time the coffee got cold. She had stood up and made Drummond publicly commit to serving everyone in the valley. Drummond had smiled and agreed, because he had no other move in that room. In front of those men. Smart, Cole thought, whether she knew it or not. He turned away, then turned back once, looked at the clinic window, then walked on by day 5. Clara had settled into the shape of her days. Clinic from 7 to noon. House calls in the afternoon. Evenings for records and letters. And the kind of thinking that only happens when everything else goes quiet. She wrote to the Women's Medical College in Philadelphia about treatment protocols for early-stage tuberculosis. She wrote to a colleague in St. Louis about herbal preparations she'd been using for respiratory conditions. She wrote to no one in Boston. There was nothing left to say there. The Chinese community had started coming more consistently. Word traveled the way it always does in small places, through kitchens and doorways and the spaces between buildings, where people talk when they don't want to be overheard. She explains before she touches. She doesn't make you wait while the white patients go first. She looked at Lily Sung like Lily was a person, the Reyes boy. Jorge Jr. came in on Thursday with a cough that had been going on for 6 weeks. She listened to his chest, asked his mother how long it had been happening and when it got worse and whether anything made it better. Asthma, mild but real. She prescribed breathing exercises and wrote out a preparation using ingredients the family could get from the general store. She wrote it in plain language on a page from her notebook and told Maria Reyes that if anything in the instructions wasn't clear, she should come back and they would work through it together. Maria folded the paper and put it in her apron pocket with the careful attention of someone who understood. They were holding something valuable. On her morning walk, Clara saw James Sung in the bakery doorway. He was watching her, not suspiciously. Exactly, more like a man running a careful assessment with no hurry to finish it. She nodded. He nodded back. She kept walking. He wasn't ready yet. She understood that. Trust has its own pace, and you don't get to set it for someone else. The Drummond Care House was a 2-story building on the east side of town. Clean enough, well-maintained. The invitation from Drummond had come as a note delivered to the clinic. I thought you and Mrs. Pratt might benefit from a professional exchange. Clara had read it twice and understood it was not an invitation. It was a look at what's already here. Mrs. Pratt ran the facility, the way someone runs a thing they are good at, and have stopped thinking about. Efficient, correct, and utterly incurious about whether the people inside it were well or only maintained. She showed Clara around with the brisk pace of someone whose time was organized. The patients were not here because they needed this level of institutional care. Clara could see that inside of 10 minutes, they were here because they were connected, each in some way, to Drummond's land company. A farmer behind on a note, a widow with a dispute about property lines, a young man whose older brother owed money. The treatment was real, but it was also a leash. Nobody said so. Nobody had to. At the end of the hall, in the last room, Nora Maddox was sitting by the window reading. The book was Gray's Anatomy, the 1858 edition. Clara recognized the binding before she could read the title. She stopped in the doorway. Nora looked up. She had dark eyes, sharp, with the particular alertness of someone who reads a great deal and has learned to hold most of what they think to themselves. You're the new doctor, Nora said. Not a question. You're the only person in this building reading a medical textbook. It's my brother's, he brought it. Clara sat down. She did not ask about symptoms. She asked about the book, about the differences between the 1858 edition and the more recent understanding of pulmonary tissue structure, what they'd gotten right, what they'd missed. Nora talked, and the girl who talked was not a patient. She was a young woman who was sharp and curious and had been sitting in this room with too much time and too little to do with her mind. She asked good questions. She had opinions. She had read the anatomy 3 times and had notes in the margins in pencil. After 15 minutes, Clara said she'd like to do the examination now, if that was all right. Nora said yes. Early-stage tuberculosis. Clara was careful and complete, and she was certain. The good news was genuine. This was manageable. The right treatment, clean mountain air and time. The bad news was that the care Nora was receiving here was not wrong. Exactly, but it was not current. And the setting indoors. Limited sunlight. Close air was working against her in ways that could be changed. Mr. Drummond says my brother can't care for me properly, Nora said, that I need this facility. That's not accurate as a medical statement, Clara said. Nora looked at her for a moment. I know, she said then, quieter. But Cole doesn't know I know. After dark, Cole was on the east fence line. Officially, he was running a cattle check. Actually, he was looking for the man who kept cutting the wire on the western boundary. 3rd time in 2 weeks. The cattle didn't escape through the cuts. They were driven through. Someone was moving the neighboring family's stock onto Drummond's range, and then claiming the animals had wandered in. Hank Corbin had lost 15 head that way the month before. Hank hadn't said much about it because there was no one in Redemption Creek whose job it was to listen. Cole heard the voices before he saw the men, two of them coming down the eastern trail. He recognized Ives's voice. The other he didn't know. They were talking about the new nurse. Drummond wants to know who she's talking to, Ives said. She saw the Sun Girl again this morning. Stopped to talk with the Crow Elder outside the feed store. Went to the Ray's place at noon. Cole did not move, did not breathe. Let her run. Drummond says watch who comes to her. Anyone who talks to her is someone we need to know about. They moved on. Cole stood in the dark for 3 full minutes without moving. They were using her as a trap. Every person who trusted her. Every person who came to her clinic or spoke to her on the street. James Sung, Nora, Gray Horse. Any of them could be flagged. He had to warn her. The problem was how to do it without explaining how he knew, which meant explaining what he was doing inside Drummond's operation, which was a conversation he had never intended to have with anyone. He knocked on the clinic door at 10 o'clock. Clara was at the desk with her notes. She looked up without surprise. Are you injured? No. Then why are you here at 10 at night? Need to talk. They sat across the table from each other in the lamplight. It was the first time they had actually sat down together. He noticed she didn't make anything out of it, just pulled her chair out and waited for him to say what he came to say. He said it plainly. Drummond is watching who comes to you. Anyone he sees talking to you gets noted. How do you know that? A long pause. I work for him. I know. Cole looked at her. And you're not going to ask why I'm here warning you. I am asking, she said. I'm just not saying it out loud yet. She looked at him steadily. Why? He didn't answer the question directly. He said James Sung is a decent man. Nora shouldn't be in that facility. Gray Horse has a legal treaty that's being worked around. Drummond is doing wrong things to people who don't have any way to stop him. He stopped. I can't do anything about it by myself, Clara. Watched him. Then she said, James Sung gave me something. A record of 18 months of payments. Protection money. Paid to Drummond's operation to avoid being reported to the immigration authorities. Cole went completely still. Where is it? Safe. There's nowhere in Redemption Creek safe enough for that. They sat with that for a moment. Two people who had arrived at the same place from completely different directions. Both of them understanding that they had just made a decision without formally making it. Clara said, Can you speak Crow? Basic. Gray Horse needs to know I want to help with the treaty. Not as a lawyer, as someone who can get that document to Washington, if it comes to it. Cole looked at her for a long time. You understand what you're saying. I understand it will be inconvenient, she said. Progress usually is. When he stood to leave, he stopped at the door. Didn't turn around. Nora, what's your real assessment? Clara told him the truth without softening it. Early stage tuberculosis. Controllable. She did not need to be in that facility. I'm not telling you this to make you feel better. I'm telling you because it's the medical reality and you have the right to know it. He was quiet for 1 full second. Thank you, he said. 2 words. From a man who used very few of them. They landed heavier than most people's paragraphs. After he left, Clara sat at the dark window. The land office was lit again. She had now seen it lit at night 4 times. Someone in that room after midnight, doing something. They apparently needed darkness around. She decided she was going to find out who. Cole brought her north on a Tuesday morning, not as a guide. He was clear about that in the way he moved beside her, not ahead of her, making no decisions about the pace, except when the terrain genuinely required it. She noticed the difference. She had spent enough years being managed by men who thought management was the same as help to know what each one looked like. The valley changed as they rode north. The soil went darker. The grass thickened. A small creek ran along the eastern edge of the treaty acres, and Clara saw it the same way she saw a patient's color as information. This ground was different from the lower valley. Better drained, better fed, more productive by a long measure. She understood immediately why Drummond wanted it. Spotted elk met them at the edge of the settlement. He walked carefully on his mended leg, favoring it, but not avoiding weight, which was exactly right. He looked at Clara and nodded. Cole told her later that a nod from Spotted Elk was not a small thing. Chief Gray Horse was 70 years old, and he moved like a man who had decided some time ago that there was no hurry left in the world worth subscribing to. He was not slow. He was deliberate. There is a difference. He listened to Cole's introduction and then looked at Clara for a long moment before he said anything. They sat on the flat rocks above the valley, the three of them, with the mountains behind and the creek below. Gray Horse began to speak. Cole translated, finding the right words carefully, not rushing. In 1868, we put our names on paper, Gray Horse said. I was 15. I stood beside my father, and I watched the men sign. I believed it meant what it said, that the grass and the water would stay ours as long as they grew and ran. Clara listened. She did not fill the space between his sentences with her own thoughts. This was something she had practiced for years in examining rooms, the discipline of actually hearing what someone said before deciding what it meant. It was harder than it sounded. Most people listened just long enough to start forming their response. Gray Horse continued, I have since learned what Americans do when they need land, and they have a paper in the way. They do not tear the paper. They say the paper was misunderstood. It is a more polite way to say the same thing. Drummond could not legally take the treaty land. The 1,868 agreement was still technically enforceable in federal court, so he had bought a narrow strip of land above the creek's source. If he redirected the water upstream, the treaty acres would dry out within a single growing season. The paper would still exist. The land it described would be worthless. They do not need to destroy the document, Gray Horse said. Cole translated slowly, getting the weight of it right. They only need to make the document meaningless. That is the real power. Not doing wrong, making right impossible. Clara sat with that. She turned it over. The way she turned over a difficult diagnosis. The land office light burning at midnight. The cuts in the fence wire. The loan documents with the buried clauses. The care facility that treated patients just well enough to keep them dependent. All of it the same pattern. Not breaking the law. Bending the conditions until following the law led nowhere. She asked questions. She asked about the creek, and where it came from, and who owned the land above it, and when Drummond had made the purchase. Gray Horse answered each one with the patience of a man who understood that the right questions were the beginning of something, not an interruption of it. When she finally went quiet, Gray Horse looked at her for a moment. Then he said something in Crow that Cole translated as, she listens the way water moves. She finds the lowest place and goes there. Clara was not sure she entirely understood it, but it sounded more like respect than not. Cole walked her down to the creek source after. She stood at the bank and looked at the geography of it. The upstream land Drummond had purchased was a narrow strip, barely wide enough to be useful for anything except what he planned to use it for. If he redirects here, she said, the water goes east. The treaty land dries out in one growing season. That's right. Is it legal? Cole thought about it. Technically, it's his land above the source. Technically, he can do what he wants with water flowing through his own property. But the treaty protects water usage. Who enforces that, he said? The federal court in Washington. While the land sits dry, Clara stood looking at the water for a moment. This was the thing they hadn't taught in Boston. They had taught her the law. They had taught her ethics. They had not taught her what happened when the people responsible for upholding the law had decided it didn't apply to them. Law needed someone with the authority and the will to enforce it. Separate those two things, and you had a very well-written document that didn't do anything. On the ride back south, they came across Hank Corbin mending a fence section on the edge of his property. Fourth time this month, by Cole's count. Hank looked up when he heard them coming. He recognized Cole. He looked at Clara. Then away, then back, he said. To neither of them, exactly. My wife says I need to tell someone before we lose everything. I don't know if you're the right person, but I don't have anyone else. The Corbins had come to Wyoming in 1878. They had built a farm from raw land, which meant they had built it from scratch, which meant every board and post and fenced acre represented years of work that couldn't be replaced. Last spring, the East pasture flooded. They borrowed from Drummond's Land Company because Drummond's Land Company was the only place to borrow from inside of 3 days' ride. The interest rate was 18% annually, higher than the territorial legal limit, but no one checked. And even if they had, checking would have required going through someone who worked for Drummond. We could make the payments if the season was decent, Hank said. The season's not decent because my cattle keep getting lost. He said the last 2 words in the precise, flat tone of a man who knows exactly what those words mean and what they don't. Do you have the original loan document? Clara asked. Yeah, can I read it? Hank looked at Cole. Cole gave the smallest nod. I'll bring it tonight, Hank said. He came to the clinic after dark. He set the document on the table and stood back, holding his hat, the way people hold things when they're waiting for news they're not sure they want. Clara read it. She was not a lawyer. She had never been to law school, and she had no intention of pretending otherwise. But she had a law-trained professor at medical college who had spent 2 full lectures on what to look for in institutional documents. And she had a habit, going back to childhood, of reading everything before she signed it. It made her slow, but it kept her from being surprised. She found it in the appendix. Small print, 3rd paragraph. A clause stating that in the event of any dispute, resolution would be determined by a representative of Drummond Land Company. Drummond had written himself the right to judge his own cases. This clause is void, she said. Territorial law doesn't allow a party to adjudicate their own dispute. No court would uphold this. Hank stared at her. Who tells Drummond that? A federal court would. Cole, from the corner where he'd been standing quiet. And how does a document reach a federal court without going through Marshal Ives? The 3 of them sat with that. It was the same problem as the treaty, and the same problem as the care facility, and the same problem as the land office burning at midnight. The local system ran through Drummond. To get around Drummond, you had to get outside the local system entirely. The Federal Postal Service, Clara said, not the town post. The Federal Mail Office reports to Washington, not to Ives. She looked at Cole. Where's the nearest federal mail drop? Casper. 2 days' ride. Then someone needs to go to Casper. Hank looked at the loan document on the table. He looked like a man who had spent 2 years believing a wall was permanent and had just been shown a door in it. Not easy, not simple, but there. After Hank left, Clara stayed at the table and began writing. She was drafting a letter to the federal marshal's office. She was also making a list of everything she had seen in 3 weeks that didn't add up. The fence cuts, the moved cattle, the care facility, the loan clause, the land purchase above the creek, the town council meeting where Drummond had smiled and agreed to serve everyone because she had forced him to say it in public. It was late when she heard the sound at the door. Not a knock. A folded piece of paper sliding through the gap below it. She picked it up, 3 lines, written in careful, even handwriting. Not Mrs. Pratt's hand, someone else's. I need to speak with you privately, not at the facility. I remember something about the night my father died, and I think you need to know what it is. Can you come tomorrow? No name at the bottom, but Clara had seen that handwriting in the margins of a copy of Gray's Anatomy. Penciled notes, small and precise. She sat down and read the note again. This was not a disappearance. This was a summons, and whoever had written it had taken a significant risk to send it. Clara set the paper down. She looked at the lamp. Outside Redemption Creek was quiet and dark and going about its nighttime business. She had a feeling that was about to change. Nora had taken a room at the boarding house. She had been saving money for 2 years, small amounts, carefully hidden from Mrs. Pratt's inventory checks. She had slipped out of the care facility on a Tuesday morning with her savings, her copy of Gray's Anatomy, and nothing else. She left a note that said simply, "Gone to see my brother. I didn't tell you first because you would have told Mr. Drummond." She was right. Mrs. Pratt had told Drummond before she told Cole. Clara found out when she arrived at the care facility on Wednesday afternoon and found Drummond already there, standing in the entryway with his hands clasped in front of him, and that particular expression he wore when something had gone wrong that he was in the process of reframing as something else. His eyes moved to her when she walked in, quick, assessing, then back to neutral. She filed that Cole found out last. By the time he came looking for Clara that evening, she already knew where Nora was. Room 7 at the boarding house. End of the hall, the one with the window facing the mountains. Clara had gone to her that morning, before clinic hours, without telling anyone. Nora looked fragile. She also looked entirely like herself, which was different from fragile. Her mind was completely sharp, and she had been using the quiet of the room to finish rereading the anatomy and to write out, in the margins of a small notebook, everything she remembered about the night her father died. She told Clara what she had told no one except Cole when she was small, back when she thought a child's memory was the kind of thing adults took seriously. On the night William Maddox died, a woman came to the house. Nora was 3 years old. She remembered 2 things clearly. The color of the woman's dress, green, a deep green, the color of pine needles, and what the woman said when she picked Nora up and carried her out into the yard. Don't be inside tonight, little one. Nora didn't understand why until she was older. When she finally understood, she started asking questions about the woman, about Eleanor Drummond, whose name she eventually learned from a careless remark someone made at the care facility. She had asked Mrs. Pratt directly once. Mrs. Pratt was in Drummond's office the same afternoon. After that, Nora's medication schedule changed. Her meals became less consistent. The window in her room was kept closed because of drafts. Nobody said anything outright. Nobody had to. Her name is Eleanor Drummond, Nora told Clara. She knew what was going to happen that night. She couldn't stop it. But she got me out of the house first. When Cole came in and heard the last part of it, the woman in the green dress, he sat down with the particular care of a man managing something heavy. I thought you were dreaming, he said. He said it to his sister. But he wasn't really talking to her. He was talking to the 8-year-old boy who had decided, eventually, that a 3-year-old's memory couldn't be trusted. I know, Nora said. I stopped telling you. The formal notice arrived the next morning, a document from the town council, signed by Marshal Ives, informing Clara that her clinic was required to obtain certification from the Territorial Medical Board within 7 days or suspend operations. Clara spent an hour in the church library going through the territorial code. She was methodical about it. She checked every section that could possibly apply. There was no such requirement in territorial law. The Territorial Medical Board was a real body, but it had no authority to impose operating conditions on individual practitioners. This requirement had been invented. Agnes was at the clinic door by the time Clara got back, already furious on her behalf. Clara sat her down and explained it the way she would explain a diagnosis to a patient who needed to understand the treatment before agreeing to it. If I fight this now, I fight it in front of a local judge who belongs to Drummond. That's a fight I lose. I need a federal basis, and to get federal attention, I need to show this isn't one bad decision. It's a pattern, manufactured obstacles, one after another, designed to push me out. Then we document the pattern, Agnes said. That's exactly what we do. The rock came through the clinic window at 2 in the afternoon. No note, no signature, just a jagged piece of granite that took out the lower left pane and left glass across the floor. Deputy Eli Cobb came to take the report. He was young and he was earnest, and he stood in the middle of the room holding his notebook with the expression of a man trying to do his job and starting to understand that his job might be more complicated than he had thought. He said he would ask around. Clara said, "You and I both know what happens when you find out who threw it." He started to answer, she said. "You're young, Deputy. You still have the chance to decide what kind of lawman you want to be. That window doesn't stay open forever." He left without writing much in the notebook. He came back at 4 in the afternoon with the name of the man who had thrown the rock, one of Drummond's ranch hands. He handed her the name, written on a folded piece of paper and left again without saying anything else. That was the first time Eli Cobb did something that Marshall Ives didn't know about. He wrote the name in his personal notebook that night with the date. He wasn't sure why. Something in him was keeping a record, something that understood. On a level below conscious thought, that records mattered. That same afternoon, Drummond rode out to the Hendricks property. The Hendricks family had signed over their 40-acre farm to the land company 6 weeks earlier after they couldn't meet their loan obligations. Drummond went because he always visited newly acquired land. It was a habit. He crouched at the fence line near the eastern boundary and picked up a handful of soil. He turned it in his palm and let it fall through his fingers. He looked at the drainage pattern across the field. He looked at the angle of the slope and where the sun would reach it in the afternoon. This ground would carry 300 head, he told the foreman riding with him. Hendricks was running 40 sheep on it. 40 sheep on ground like this. He stood up and brushed his hands on his ears. It's not waste if someone puts it to use. He said it the way you state an obvious fact. No cruelty in it, no pleasure. He genuinely believed the Hendricks land had been mismanaged, and that what he was doing was correcting the misallocation. This was his worldview, complete and internally consistent, and he had never had a reason to question it that he couldn't find a way around. He was still wearing his wedding ring. Agnes came to the clinic at dusk with Danny. She had a list. 3 farming families who had received notices that morning demanding loan repayment in 30 days instead of the 90 their contracts specified. The stated reason was property maintenance violations, a clause vague enough to mean whatever Drummond needed it to mean on any given day. One of the families had a child Clara had treated 2 weeks earlier, a boy with asthma, 7 years old. She had shown his mother how to manage the breathing exercises. She had written out the preparation in plain language. If they lose the farm, Clara said. Where do they go? Nobody knows. Agnes said, that's the point. Clara looked out the window at the mountains to the west. The sun was behind them now, the peaks dark against a fading sky. She thought about the letter that had brought her here. 3 children dead in a year. I don't need you to have a title. I need you to show up. She had shown up. She was still here. I'm staying, she said. Not in response to a question, not as a dramatic declaration. As a statement of fact, the way you state facts, because it was simply what was going to happen. Agnes looked at her. Drummond will make it worse. Clara, he's already making it worse. Agnes, more than this. Clara turned from the window and looked at her directly. When did you decide to stay after Robert died? Agnes was quiet for a moment. That same night. Clara nodded. Then you know the answer to your own question. Cole came late that evening. He sat across from her at the clinic table and said nothing about the meeting with Drummond, which she already knew about, because Redemption Creek was small enough and the walls were thin enough, he said. He knows who you've talked to. Every person. I don't know how he tracks it, but he does. Clara looked at him steadily. I know it was you telling him, not because you wanted to, because you had to. Cole sat very still. You're here warning me now because you've made a different choice. I didn't have options, he said. You always have options, she said. You're exercising one right now. You just haven't named it yet. James Sung came to the clinic before dawn on a Friday. He knocked quietly and waited. Clara was already up, already dressed, already at the table with her notebook and her father's bag open beside her. She had started most mornings this way. It helped her think. He sat down across from her and set his hands flat on the table, which was something she had noticed he did. When he was about to say something he had considered carefully and was ready to commit to. He had information. A man in his community had worked as a surveyor for Drummond's land company the previous year. He had been in the mountain cabin twice. He had seen in the back room a black ledger that was kept separately from the company's standard financial records. He had seen Drummond open it once to make a notation. He had not seen what was written inside, but he had seen the cover, and he had seen the way Drummond handled it, which was different from how he handled everything else. Careful, private, the way you handle something that can't be replaced and can't be explained. I've been sitting with this for 3 weeks, James Sung said. I watched you. I watched how you work. I watched you keep going after the rock through the window. I watched you treat old Pete Harker for his arthritis at no charge because he had no money. He paused. I think you use information the way it deserves to be used. Then he said, Drummond does not frighten people who have already lost everything. After Pearl died, he frightened me less. Pearl was his wife. Clara didn't know the name yet. She heard the weight behind it and did not ask. Some things you wait to be told. Cole knew the cabin. He had been there once, 6 months ago, riding with Drummond on a property boundary inspection. 8,000 feet up, a full day's hard ride through mountain terrain. Drummond was occupied with investors from Cheyenne for the next 3 days. He would not go up the mountain during that time. The window was narrow, but it was there. Clara said she was going. Cole said no. It was the first real argument they had. And it was short because he ran out of ground quickly. His argument was terrain and experience. Her counter-argument was simple. If he found the ledger, he needed someone who could read it and assess its value as legal evidence. That required a specific kind of knowledge. She had it. He didn't. He had no answer for that. They left at 4 in the morning. 6 hours to the cabin with good horses. Cole rode slightly ahead on the steeper grades. Not as a statement, just as practical sense. And Clara rode behind and watched the country change around her as they climbed. The valley floor gave way to pine forest. The pines to scrub and rock. The rock to the kind of open alpine terrain that made Boston feel like something she had imagined rather than lived in. The air was cold even in summer, thin, smelling of pine resin and something sharper underneath. Stone and snow, the particular emptiness of altitude. The sun was stronger than it felt. She was going to burn if she wasn't careful. They rode in stretches of silence that were completely comfortable. She had noticed this about Cole from the beginning. The silence was not awkward or pointed. It was simply space, and he inhabited it the same way he inhabited a room, without apology and without need. They talked when there was something to say. She told him not about Boston's prestige, but about its 2 in the morning version. A printing press worker who came into the receiving area with a crushed hand. No male physician available. Clara the only trained person in the building. She had set the hand, saved 2 of the 3 threatened fingers, and written the case up in the records as a nursing intervention, because that was the only language the institution would accept. Cole rode without turning around. After a moment, he said, "Did that make you angry?" "It did," she said, "for a while. Now I just want to work somewhere they call the work what it is." He was quiet again. On a long, flat stretch, he talked about his father, not about the death, about the man. William Maddox, who read to his children every night, despite having completed only 3 years of schooling. Who believed that land was for growing what you needed and raising what you loved, he told me once. Cole, the rest of it is just want dressed up as need. A pause while his horse picked carefully around a section of loose rock. He never thought that sentence might be the reason they killed him. Clara didn't offer anything in response. She just let the truth of it exist between them, in the cold mountain air, which was the most honest thing she could do with it. 1 hour below the summit, the trail narrowed to single file. Rock face on the left, open slope falling away to nothing on the right. Clara's horse stepped onto a section of loose shale and lurched sideways, the way mountain horses sometimes do. A sharp instinctive shift of weight that a rider who grew up on flat ground doesn't anticipate the way a rider who grew up here would. She didn't go over the edge. She went left into the rock face, and her left shoulder took the full impact. She knew immediately it wasn't broken. She knew the mechanics of it. She had studied them. She had set other people's dislocations. She understood exactly what her body had done. The joint had shifted partially out of position. The pain was immediate and specific and bad enough that she let herself slide down to sit against the rock rather than stay on her feet pretending. Cole was off his horse before she had fully processed the sequence of events. He was beside her in seconds, crouching, his hands already moving to her shoulder with the careful, knowledgeable touch of a man who had spent a quarter century working with large animals and the injuries they caused. He was not a doctor. He had never studied anatomy in a school. But necessity is a thorough teacher, and his hands knew what they were finding. Not broken, he said, shifted. I can put it back. It'll hurt. She looked up at him. He was close, closer than they had been since that first night on the road, and his focus was absolute. There was no uncertainty in his expression. He had done this before, not to a person, maybe, but to the same structure, and the structure was the same. Do it, she's certain. Asking once is courtesy, she said. Asking twice is delay. Something at the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Close. He repositioned, one hand below her elbow, one hand steady at the joint. Breathe in, he said. She breathed. He reset the joint. The pain came in a single sharp wave, and she grabbed his sleeve with her right hand and pressed her lips together hard and did not make a sound. He held position without releasing, without hurrying, steady as the rock behind her, until the joint settled and her breathing evened out. Then he waited another few seconds. The hand on her shoulder did not move. Wind came down from the summit. Pine and cold stone, it hurts, she said. Her voice was level, clinical, almost, like she was taking her own notes. I know, but I trust you. He didn't answer immediately. He was looking at her face and not at her shoulder. When he finally said something, it wasn't about the shoulder. His hand stayed where it was for another few seconds, past the point of medical necessity. Neither of them said anything about that. The cabin was one room, cold despite the season, built for function and not comfort, with a cot and a stove and shelves of supplies and the specific feel of a place no one had been in recently. Cole went straight to the floor. He pressed along the boards in a systematic pattern, listening for the hollow sound, until he found it. 4 minutes, maybe 5. A shallow compartment, a flat tin box, a simple latch. Clara opened it. Her left hand ached. Her right hand held the ledger steady. The writing inside was small and precise. Drummond's hand, she had seen his signature on official documents, and it matched. She read the first page, then the second. Then she looked up. WMSE arrangement, November 1875. Crane, $15. She held his gaze. This is the record of your father's death. J. Crane is the farrier. He was paid $15. Cole didn't read it. He watched her face the way she had seen him watch terrain, looking for the shape of what was real underneath what was visible. Is it enough, he asked. At least 14 federal counts, she said, and enough to know who gave the order. She closed the ledger and put it inside her coat. On the descent, Cole rode beside her rather than ahead. The downhill grade was where mountain riding went wrong, and her left shoulder was bandaged and stiff, and she was going to need to compensate for the imbalance in her weight. When the trail got narrow and she drifted toward the loose edge, his hand came out and caught her arm. Fast, instinctive. When she steadied, he didn't let go right away. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. Halfway down, she looked at the tree line on the right. The birds had gone quiet. No wind, but no birds either. Someone's below us, she said. Cole stopped and listened and then said, quietly, from the east. They rerouted through a hunter's track he knew from years of riding this mountain. It added 2 hours. It kept them off the main approach. They reached the valley floor at dusk. The ledger was safe. Her shoulder would be stiff for a week. Cole turned his horse toward town and then stopped. He didn't look back right away. Clara, first time without a title, she noticed. She waited. Thank you, he said, and she understood that he didn't mean today. She locked the clinic door and dimmed the lamp and read the ledger from the first page to the last. She did not skip anything. She did not skim. This was how she had been trained to do an examination completely, in order, without deciding what mattered before you had seen everything. Decisions made before the full picture was in front of you were guesses wearing the clothes of conclusions. She read for 4 hours. William Maddox, WM Obstacle Resolved SE, Arrangement, Nov 1875. Crane, 15, the notation was clean and businesslike. The way you write down a payment for a load of lumber or a day's labor. A man's life purchased for $15 and entered into the records as a line item. The Chinese community. 18 months of protection arrangement payments, logged with dates and amounts that matched James Sung's records exactly. Corroboration, the kind that held up. Gray Horse's Water. GH, water diversion hydraulic confirmed, date pending. Less than 3 weeks out. Robert Bright, RB. Structural failure. Arranged April 1882. She read that 3 times. Arranged. She set the ledger down and sat with her hands flat on the table. 2 minutes. She had learned to do this to give herself a fixed amount of time to absorb something before she moved on. Because if you never stopped to absorb it, you started making errors. And errors in medicine cost people things they couldn't get back. She was a physician. She knew how to receive hard information without fragmenting. She had delivered it enough times to understand what it required. But reading the word arranged next to the name of a man whose widow was sleeping 200 yards away, with her sons that required a different kind of steadiness than anything a classroom had given her. She did not let herself cry. She opened her notebook and began to transcribe every entry, every date, every name and amount and notation, because this was evidence, and evidence had to be recorded accurately. And her handwriting at this hour was still steady enough to be legible, and that was what mattered right now. She worked until 3 in the morning. She went to Agnes's farm before clinic hours. Agnes was already up, already in the kitchen, already starting the stove. Danny was in the corner with a book. He looked up when Clara came in and then looked back down at the page. But the page stopped turning. Clara sat across from Agnes at the kitchen table and said it plainly, because Agnes had never once asked to be handled gently, and Clara was not going to start now. I found Robert's name in Drummond's ledger. She let Agnes have a moment. He didn't die in an accident. Agnes's hands were on the table. They did not move. She said nothing for nearly a full minute. Danny had stopped even pretending to read. The stove ticked. Then Agnes said, "I know. I've known since the night it happened." Her voice was flat and even. But knowing and being able to prove it are 2 different things. She looked at Clara. "Now you have proof." "Yes." "Then tell me what we do with it." This was Agnes Bright. This was what 2 years of knowing and not being able to prove it had made her. Not destroyed, not collapsed, prepared. She was asking a practical question because she had already done the falling apart, in private, in whatever form it had taken. And she had come out the other side of it still standing in her kitchen at 5 in the morning, ready to know what came next. Clara told her what she was planning. Agnes listened without interrupting. When Clara was done, Agnes said, "All right," 2 words. Then she went back to the stove. The letter arrived that afternoon. The return address was Cheyenne. The wax seal was green, the specific deep green of pine needles in shade. And when Clara saw it, she thought of a 3-year-old girl carried out of a house in the dark. Eleanor Drummond wrote in a small, precise hand, the handwriting of someone educated carefully a long time ago. She had heard about the female physician in Redemption Creek from a mutual acquaintance. She had been deciding whether to write for 3 weeks. She wrote, "I know what Silas has done. I left because I could no longer live alongside it. My silence since then has been part of the same problem, and I have understood that for a long time. I was present on the night William Maddox died. I could not prevent it. I took the child outside because it was the only thing available to me. I am prepared to testify before a federal court if there is someone who can give me a credible assurance of protection." Clara read it twice. Then she wrote a reply immediately and walked it to the federal mail station on the far side of town, the one that reported to Washington and not to Ives. She walked fast. The letter was in the box before she let herself think too much about what it meant. The seed had been planted 6 weeks ago in a boarding house conversation about cold winters. Clara had not known then what it would grow into. She knew now. Cole was at the clinic when she got back. He read the letter once and set it down on the table and looked at it without speaking for a moment. Then he said, "We need to go see Pete Harker." Old Pete's cabin was on the valley's edge, backed up against the first rise of pine forest, the kind of place a man builds when he wants to be close enough to town to get supplies and far enough away to think clearly. Pete was 78 and moved slowly, but his eyes were as sharp as they had ever been. And when Cole walked through the door, Pete looked at him the way a man looks at something he has been carrying for a very long time and has finally found a place to set down. "It's time," Pete said. Nobody had asked him anything yet. He told it straight. He had been out hunting late on a November night in 1875, and he had come down the South Ridge Trail and seen two men stopped on the road. One was a farrier named Crane. The other Pete didn't know. Crane was doing something to the shoe of a horse, tied to a fence post on the side of the road. Not reattaching it, loosening it in a specific way that would hold for a little while, and then fail at exactly the wrong moment on exactly the right stretch of road. Pete had stood in the dark at the edge of the tree line and watched and said nothing. His granddaughter was 9 years old that year, and she lived alone with him because her parents were gone and he was all she had. Drummond knew that. Drummond made sure Pete understood that Drummond knew it, not with a threat. You didn't have to make a threat when the information itself was the threat. "She's been married 6 years now," Pete said. "Lives in Kansas. Got 2 kids of her own. He can't reach her anymore." He looked at Cole, and his voice didn't change, but something in his face did. "Your daddy was a decent man." "Cole, I didn't protect him. I can do this now." Cole nodded once. It was not a small nod. Pete looked at Clara. "Staying quiet in front of wrong isn't the same as staying out of it. You're making a choice either way. And that choice has a cost. Not for the man doing the wrong, for the man who looked away." He said it the way. "You say things you have said to yourself many times in the dark. Things you have turned over so often the edges have worn smooth." It was not a speech. It was a fact he had been living with for 25 years. Clara drove back through town that afternoon and noticed, passing the deputy's office, that the light inside was on, even though it was mid-afternoon, and Ives usually left early. Through the window, she could see Eli Cobb at the desk, alone with his notebook open. She found out later what he was writing. Ives had directed him to monitor who came to the clinic and report back. Eli had been doing this for 2 weeks. He had been giving Ives incomplete reports. He had been keeping a separate, accurate record in his personal notebook, the dates and names, and what he had actually seen. He was not fully sure why. Something in him understood that there might come a day when someone asked him where he had been and what he had done, and he wanted to be able to answer honestly. Tonight, he was adding a new entry. Clara Whitfield treated Chief Gray Horse's grandson for a broken rib from a fall. No charge. I told Marshal Ives there were no notable visitors to the clinic today. He closed the notebook and put it in his coat pocket and sat there for a while before he got up and went home. Clara found the padlock when she arrived at the clinic the next evening. New hardware, fitted to the outer door, locked from the outside. A notice nailed above it on official town council paper. Temporarily closed, pending facility inspection. No date for reopening, no contact for questions. She stood in front of it for a moment. Then she heard her name. She turned around. Mei Sung was on the street behind her, holding Lily. The child's face was flushed. She was feverish again, her head against her mother's shoulder, her eyes partly closed. Clara looked at the padlock. She looked at May and Lily. She picked up her father's bag. "Come with me," she said. She took them to the boarding house and put Lily on the bed in her room and opened her bag and went to work. The clinic in her bedroom was still a clinic. The lock on the door across the street was a piece of hardware. Medicine was not a piece of hardware. May stood by the window and watched. When Clara had finished the examination and was writing out the new instructions, May said something in Mandarin. Soft, just a few words. Clara looked up. She didn't understand the words. She understood everything else. "She'll be all right," Clara said. "Same as before." We caught it early. May nodded. She folded her hands in front of her and looked at Clara with an expression that Clara was going to carry for the rest of her life without ever quite finding the words for it. Outside, Redemption Creek went on with its evening. The saloon was warming up. The church bell rang for 6 o'clock. And across the street, the padlock on the clinic door caught the last of the light, and held it for a moment before the sun went down. Drummond called Cole to the ranch house on a Thursday morning, not the office, the private study, at the back of the main house, which meant something different. The office was where Drummond conducted business. The study was where he made decisions. Cole had been in it twice before. Both times the conversation had ended with someone losing something. There was no whiskey on the table, no warmth in the room at all. Just Drummond behind his desk, with a document in front of him, and Cole in the chair across from him, and the particular silence of two men who had stopped pretending to be something they weren't. Drummond set the document where Cole could read it. It was Nora's care contract from the facility. The termination clause was circled in pencil. "I don't know exactly what was taken from my mountain property," Drummond said, "but I want to make sure you understand something before we go any further." He folded his hands on the desk. Documents can look like many things. A good lawyer can argue interpretation. Courts take time, a great deal of time, and people waiting on courts have to live somewhere while they wait. He let that sit. "You've been with me 6 months. I've given you more trust and more access than anyone else on this operation. I need to know that investment was sound." Cole looked at the document. He looked at Drummond. "Are we done?" "Not yet. We are from my end." He stood up and walked out. He did not look back. Drummond sat very still after the door closed. He was a man who had built 23 years of power on his ability to read people accurately, and he had just read Cole Maddox wrong, and he knew it, and the knowing of it was moving through him like a change in weather. He picked up the care contract and placed it in the drawer. Then he reached for a different piece of paper and began to write. Cole found Clara in her boarding house room. The clinic door was still padlocked. She had set up the table by the window as a workspace, and she was writing letters when he came in. 3 of them spread out in front of her, each one at a different stage of completion. He sat down across from her. She looked at him and set her pen down. She could read the set of his jaw the way she read a patient's breathing as information, before any words were spoken. "There's something I haven't told you," he said, "about Hank Corbin." He told her 6 months ago, before Clara arrived, before any of this had a shape yet. He had seen what was coming for Hank. The flood damage in the East Pasture, the timing of Drummond's office, reaching out to the family afterward. Cole had understood exactly what was about to happen. He could have found a way to warn Hank without exposing himself. He had chosen not to. The calculation he made was that one warning would cost him the access he needed for the larger evidence, and the larger evidence would protect more people in the end. That was partly true. It was also easier. And Hank had lost 15 head of cattle that season because of a loan he might have refused if someone had told him what the terms really meant. "I'm telling you this because you should know who you're actually working with," Cole said. "Not the version I'd prefer you to know." Clara did not respond immediately. She sat with it the way she sat with everything actually sitting with it, not performing patience while she formulated her answer. When she spoke, her voice was even. "That was a wrong choice," she said. "You know that, yes. And knowing that, you're still here making a different one. Trying to. Then that's the man I'm dealing with, not the one from 6 months ago. Both of them are real. I'd rather know about both." This was not absolution. It was something more useful than absolution. It was accuracy. Cole needed to be seen clearly more than he needed to be forgiven, and she had understood that without being told. She said, "Being angry at the right target matters. Pointing anger at someone who had no power in a system that was designed against them only serves the people who built the system." He looked at her. She was not speaking about Hank anymore. She was speaking about something larger, and she knew he knew it. The gathering was that evening, Agnes's barn after dark. Word passed through whispered channels in the hours between. No announcement, no written invitation, nothing that could be noted and reported. Just Agnes's barn, 8 o'clock. "Come if you're ready." Cole came. Agnes was already there with Danny and Sam, the boys stationed at the door. James Sung arrived with 2 members of his community. Hank Corbin came, hat in hand, looking like a man who had decided that whatever happened next, couldn't be worse than what was already happening. Old Pete made the walk from his cabin, moving slowly, but arriving without help. Chief Gray Horse came with spotted elk, and Cole moved to stand near them to translate. Two people arrived who hadn't been invited. Eli Cobb stood at the barn door with his personal notebook in his breast pocket. "I'm not sure I belong here," he said. "But I'm not sure I don't," Clara said. "Come in." Ray Sutter from the land office came last. He stood with his hat in both hands and looked at the floor and said one sentence. "I have 3 children, and I don't want them asking me someday where I was tonight." Clara laid out what they had. Drummond's private ledger, James Sung's payment records, Pete Harker's eyewitness account, Eleanor Drummond's letter from Cheyenne, a named witness willing to testify, the Corbin loan contract with its void arbitration clause, Gray Horse's treaty documents, and the evidence of the planned water diversion. It was enough. If it reached the right court, the problem was the same problem it had always been. Getting evidence to a federal marshal meant going around Marshal Ives. The nearest federal marshal's office was in Casper. 2 days' ride, Pete said. "I'll go." Everyone looked at him. He was 78 years old, and he had walked to the barn that evening with a cane. "Drummond killing me creates more problems for him than leaving me alone does," Pete said. "At my age, that's worth something." Nobody argued with the logic. "You couldn't." Eli Cobb stood up. "I'll ride with him. As a deputy, I can certify the document signatures. Ives won't know we've gone until we're already a day out." It was the most significant decision Eli Cobb had made since he came west looking for opportunity. He had found it. It just didn't look the way he had imagined. After the others began to leave, Gray Horse stayed behind. He waited until the barn was nearly empty, and then he came to Clara and Cole and spoke. Cole translated, finding the words carefully. "I have been waiting for the law," Gray Horse said. "The law has not come to me." He explained that he had already acted. He had sent spotted elk that afternoon to 3 Crow families in the surrounding area who still had connections in the valley. He had asked them to come in the morning and stand on the treaty land. Not fight. Stand, because the land was theirs by written agreement, and they had as much right to be present on it as any man carrying a weapon. "I did not ask your permission," Gray Horse said. He looked at Clara directly. "I am telling you what I have decided." Clara nodded. "I understand." This was Gray Horse's choice, made on his own reading of the situation. It was not a response to her plan. It was a parallel plan, running alongside hers, belonging entirely to him. The distinction was everything. Before dawn the next morning, Marshal Ives arrived at Agnes's farm with 6 men and a document ordering the seizure of materials unlawfully removed from Drummond Land Company property. He came to the front door and found Cole standing in it. Cole said, "Who signed that order?" "Ives, the town council." "Not a court. The council has no authority to seize documents in a criminal investigation. That requires a court order with a judge's signature." Eli Cobb, standing behind Ives, said, "He's right, Marshal. I need to see a valid court order before we proceed." Ives looked at his own deputy. Something moved through his face. A recognition that the map he had been navigating by was no longer accurate, that the territory had rearranged itself while he was walking through it. He said, "This isn't finished." "No," Cole said, "but today it ends this way." Pete and Eli left 30 minutes later. They carried certified copies of all the documents. The originals were distributed across 3 separate locations, none of them in the valley, none of them any place Ives or Drummond could find without already knowing where to look. Clara stood in the yard and watched them ride north. She allowed herself, for the first time, to think the thought she had been keeping at arm's length for 2 weeks, that this might actually work, that the ledger, the letter, the testimony, the loan contracts, the treaty documents, that all of it together might be enough. She let herself think it for about 10 seconds. Then she went inside to write more letters. That afternoon, Drummond came to her room at the boarding house. He knocked. That was different. He had never knocked before. He had always arrived as though space was naturally his. Clara opened the door. He was not smiling. The warmth he usually wore the way other men wore coats was simply gone. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "we need to have a frank conversation." She stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in, Mr. Drummond. I've been expecting we'd get here, eventually." He sat across from her in a space that was not his. It was a small room with a writing table and a chair, and her father's medical bag hanging on the nail by the door. There was nothing in it that belonged to him or deferred to him or suggested he had any particular standing. He sat in it anyway because there was nowhere else to go. And for the first time, in a conversation with Silas Drummond, Clara felt the balance of the room shift in a direction that had nothing to do with money or title or the number of men he employed. He said, "I know you found the ledger. I know it's been copied. And I know someone rode for Casper." Clara sat across from him and said nothing. She let him continue. "So the question in front of us right now is what a resolution looks like that doesn't tear this valley apart." He leaned forward slightly. He used the word us, she noticed. "Redemption Creek runs on my investment. The cattle operation, the land company, the wages I pay if my operation gets suspended during an investigation. People lose income. Families lose stability. You came here to help people. Miss Whitfield, an investigation helps no one in the short term." He let that sit. It was a real argument. That was the thing about Drummond. He never made arguments that were entirely empty. There was always enough truth inside them to make you work to find the fault. Claire listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "I heard 3 arguments. 1, the valley depends on your money. 2, an investigation causes short-term harm. 3, therefore I should stand down." She paused. "The argument is missing its 4th point, which is that what you did to William Maddox, to Robert Bright, to Grey Horse and his people, to James Sung's community, is wrong. Not complicated, not a matter of interpretation." "Wrong," Drummond said. "That's a moral position. Yes, federal law tends to share it. Business doesn't operate on moral positions." "No," Clara said, "but federal courts do." He stood up, the face he had been wearing for 30 years, the face of a man who was always generous, always reasonable, always just a little more patient than the situation required, was simply gone. He hadn't taken it off. It had run out. "I built this valley," he said. "Not anyone else. Me. 23 years of work. I will not watch a woman from Boston with a schoolbook understanding of justice take all of that and call it a crime. Then you'll need to stop the federal court," Clara said. He left. The door closed hard behind him. She sat where she was for exactly 60 seconds. She counted. Then she stood, took her father's bag from the nail by the door, and walked out. Danny Bright found Cole at the Corbin fence line at mid-morning, barefoot from running the fields, breathing hard. He said Drummond had sent 6 men to Agnes's farm. He said they had guns. Cole was already moving before Danny finished the sentence. They arrived at the farm to find Drummond's men at the gate. 6 of them, horses tied at the fence. The easy posture of men who expected this to be simple. Clara got there just behind Cole and saw them and understood immediately what Drummond had done. He had moved straight to the last move available to him. Recover the documents. Eliminate the witnesses. Do it before Casper had time to respond. And between his men and the farmhouse door, something was already happening that nobody had arranged. James Sung was there with 4 members of his community, standing quiet at the edge of the yard. Spotted Elk had come, and 2 other Crow men Clara didn't know by name, standing at the far corner of the fence. Hank Corbin was there with his neighbor from the adjacent property. The Reyes family stood beside Agnes on the porch steps, and Reverend Hale was crossing the street from the church, walking with the deliberate step of a man who had finally understood that the choice he had been avoiding was not actually a choice between trouble and peace. It was a choice between 2 different kinds of trouble, and he had been picking the wrong one. 22 people, no weapons, just presence. Drummond's men stopped at the gate. The math had changed. They looked at each other with the expression of men whose orders had been written for a simpler situation than the one they were standing in. Then one of them drew his revolver. He was young. He was nervous. The gun came out not aimed at anyone. Just out. Just there, which was sometimes worse than aimed. Everything stopped. Clara walked forward. She moved through the gathered people until she was between them and Drummond's men. both hands visible at her sides, her father's bag over one shoulder. She stopped and looked at the man with the revolver. Shooting an unarmed physician in front of 22 witnesses guarantees a hanging, she said. Her voice was the same voice she used for difficult diagnoses. Flat, clear, without drama. That's not a threat. It's a statement of territorial law. I'd encourage you to take a moment with it. The gun stayed up for 4 seconds. Then it went back in the holster. The sound came from the north road. Horses moving fast. More than 2. Clara heard it before she saw it, and she did not let herself react to it yet because she did not know yet what it was. 4 riders came down the road from the direction of Casper. They were riding hard, and they were not stopping at the edge of town. The lead rider had the seal of the United States Marshal's Office on his coat. Pete and Eli had taken the hunter's track, the one Cole had described, the one that came out north of town instead of east. They had sent the wire from Casper, and the wire had found a federal marshal who was already in the territory on a separate complaint and had been half a day's ride away when it reached him. Marshal James Whitaker pulled up in the yard and dismounted in one motion. He looked at the scene in front of him. He looked at Drummond's men. He looked at the 22 people standing in the yard. He looked at Clara, standing between them. And he looked at the bag on her shoulder. Then he looked at Drummond, who had arrived from the South Road 30 seconds earlier and was standing at the edge of his own property, watching the shape of the next 23 years rearrange itself. Whitaker said, without raising his voice, "Silas Drummond, I have a warrant signed by Federal Judge Patterson on charges of land fraud, organized coercion, conspiracy, and accessory to the killing of William Maddox in November of 1875. Drummond looked at the gathered people. He looked at the ledger in Clara's hands. She was holding it where he could see it. He looked at Grey Horse, who stood at the edge of the yard with his arms folded and the expression of a man who has been right about something for a very long time and has outlasted everyone who told him he was wrong. He looked finally at Cole. Cole was standing in the yard of Agnes Bright's farm, in the valley where he had been born, in the afternoon light. He looked like a man who had just set down something that had weighed 33 years. He looked like a man who was learning, in real time, what that felt like. Drummond said nothing. He extended his hands. The cuffs went on. His men let their guns stay on their belts and began the careful business of making themselves look like bystanders. Ives was stripped of his badge on the spot by Whitaker, who had read the case files on the ride down and had formed clear opinions. Eli Cobb was given temporary authority over the local office, effective immediately, pending formal appointment. Grey Horse stood watching the road as the wagon carrying Drummond moved north. Cole spoke to him quietly in Crow. Grey Horse answered. Cole said, "He says the land doesn't change. The people around it do." Today they changed in the right direction. Agnes stood in the center of her yard with her arms folded. She watched until the wagon was out of sight. Danny stood beside her. Nothing was said between them. Nothing needed to be. James Sung found Clara in the crowd and pressed a small wrapped package into her hands. "Bread from our community. For tomorrow. Today there is no time to eat bread." He said it with the specific warmth of a man who has spent decades surviving without losing his sense of humor. And Clara held the package against her chest and understood it for exactly what it was. That evening, the valley was quiet in a way it had not been all summer. Not the tight, watchful quiet of a place under pressure. The loose, exhausted quiet of a place that had finally put something down. Cole found Clara in her room, at the table, the closed ledger in front of her. Her left shoulder was stiff under its bandage. She was not writing. She was just sitting. "Are you checking my shoulder or checking on me?" she said, without looking up. "Both," he said. He sat across from her. They were quiet for a moment, not awkwardly. The silence between them had never been awkward. It was just space. She looked at him. "Cole, are you all right?" The question was simple and direct, aimed at him and not at the situation. And it landed in a place that questions rarely reached. People asked Cole Maddox a great many things. "Not this, I don't know," he said. It was the most honest answer available. Better than yesterday. "That's enough," she said. The silence that followed was the kind between two people who no longer needed words to close the distance between them. Something was said in it that didn't require sound. The trial was set for November in the territorial capital. The summer between Drummond's arrest and the opening of proceedings was the strangest season Clara had lived through. She had expected relief. She got something more complicated than that. Relief, yes, but underneath it, the particular fatigue that comes after sustained crisis. When the body finally understands, it can stop bracing and doesn't quite know how. The valley was changing, slowly, imperfectly, in the way things actually change as opposed to the way you imagine them changing when you're still in the middle of fighting for them. Gray Horse's treaty was formally reaffirmed by the federal court in late August. The hydraulic engineer's contract was canceled. The creek ran through the treaty land the same as it had run for 10,000 years before Silas Drummond arrived, indifferent to the argument that had been made about it. The water didn't know it had been saved. It just kept going. 3 farming families received notifications that their loan contracts were void. The illegal arbitration clause, once a federal judge looked at it, took about 20 minutes to dismantle. The inflated interest payments weren't returned, that fight was going to take longer. And Clara had written enough letters to the right offices to believe it would eventually happen, but the threat of foreclosure was gone. And men like Hank Corbin stood differently in town meetings. Not loudly, just straight. James Sung's community received written confirmation from the federal marshal's office that the protection payments had constituted criminal extortion and that no immigration violation had occurred on the part of any resident of the Chinese settlement. It was not an apology. The law was not built for apologies. It was the closest the law could come, and James Sung accepted it with the same careful dignity with which he accepted most things. Pete Harker came to the clinic for a routine visit in September and mentioned, in passing, that he was sleeping well for the first time in 25 years. He said it the way you'd mention that the weather had improved. Clara wrote it in her notes and then sat for a moment after he left and looked at what she had written. Nora moved into Agnes's spare room. What started as a place to stay while she recovered her strength became, within a month, something no one had planned. Agnes discovered that Nora could teach Danny and Sam from memory Latin grammar, basic arithmetic, history, literature, and that her health improved measurably in the mountain air with regular meals and sunlight, and the absence of institutional anxiety that had been pressing down on her for 2 years. Clara checked her every week. The numbers were moving in the right direction. Not cured. Tuberculosis didn't work that way, but controlled, which was what Clara had promised and what the medicine could deliver. The clinic reopened with a new sign. Danny Bright made it, hand-lettered on a piece of pine board. The letters slightly uneven but entirely legible. Dr. Clara Whitfield, physician, not nurse, the reconstituted town council, meeting for the first time without Drummond's appointments in the room. Approved the designation without discussion. Eli Cobb, attending as acting marshal, signed the record. In early October, Clara rode north to see Gray Horse, not for medical reasons, because she wanted to. They sat on the flat rocks above the valley. The creek ran below them, unchanged, unhurried. The mountains to the west were beginning to collect snow on their upper faces, and the light was different from what it had been in summer, lower and more angled, the kind of light that made everything look like it had been there forever. Gray Horse asked if she was staying. She said she didn't know yet, which was honest. He nodded. Good land needs people who choose it, he said, Cole translating beside her. Not people who are simply here because they have nowhere else to go. You have not reached that point yet. A pause. But you are close. Clara sat with that. She looked out at the valley and thought about the difference between fighting for the right to be somewhere and actually wanting to be there. She had spent 6 years fighting for the right. She was only now learning what the other thing felt like. Nora asked her question on a Tuesday morning, during the weekly checkup, with the directness that had become something Clara genuinely looked forward to. Do you have feelings for my brother? Clara didn't flinch. I respect him, and I find I like him more than almost anyone I've known. That's a doctor's answer. Clara looked at the window. It's also a person's answer, with the priorities in a different order. Nora was quiet for a moment. He's not good at letting people in. He thinks it costs them. She looked at Clara. He's not entirely wrong about that historically. I know, Clara said. I'm not asking him to let me in. I'm just not going anywhere. Nora looked at her steadily. That might be exactly right, she said. James Sung brought May and Lily to the clinic on a Tuesday afternoon in October. Lily was entirely well. She came in ahead of her parents and went straight to the jar of cotton balls on the examination table and began counting them with the focused intensity of a 7-year-old who has decided this is important work. May spoke for a while in Mandarin. Then James translated. She says that in her life, people have looked at our daughter as a problem to be managed, something to be tolerated or moved around. You looked at her as a person. She says she will not forget that. Clara looked at Lily, who was now arranging the cotton balls in a pattern known only to herself. She was my patient. That's what I needed to know about her, to treat her correctly. A moment. I wish that wasn't remarkable enough to be worth saying, but I understand why it is, James Sung said. Our community is going to build a school. We have been trying for 2 years. 3 families have offered the use of their yards. After everything, after the trial, after what happened this summer, we are finally going to build. He looked at her. We wanted you to know, because you were part of how this became possible. Clara understood that this was not gratitude for a favor. It was recognition of shared work. The distinction mattered more than she could easily explain. Eleanor Drummond came to Redemption Creek in late October, 1 week before the trial opened in the capital. She did not come to attend the proceedings. She came to see Nora. She was 52 years old. She had the face of someone who made a hard decision a long time ago and has been learning to live with all of it since, not just the parts that were clearly right. The meeting was in Agnes's kitchen. Clara stayed because Agnes asked her to, and Agnes asked because she wanted a witness until she knew who Eleanor was. Eleanor sat across from Nora and did not offer a long apology. She said, "That night, I did the only thing I was able to do. I have known for 12 years that it wasn't enough. I'm telling you now because you deserve to hear it from me directly, and because I am going to say it again in court." Nora looked at her for a long moment. "You did what you could do," she said simply. Not as forgiveness exactly, because forgiveness wasn't always the right word, and Nora was precise about language. As recognition, as a door that had been closed for 16 years quietly opening. I needed to know that not everyone around my father chose to look away. After Eleanor left, Clara asked if Nora was all right. "Yes," Nora said. "Some things just need to be said by the right person. Now they have been." Eleanor was not fully absolved. She had been silent for 12 years when silence was a choice, and that choice had costs. But she had done the one thing available to her on the night it mattered most. And when a larger thing finally became available, she had taken it. Human moral life lived in exactly that space. The story didn't let her off the hook. It also didn't throw her away. That was the honest thing. The verdict arrived by federal mail on a Thursday in November. Silas Drummond, guilty on 11 counts, organized land fraud, criminal coercion, conspiracy to commit bodily harm, accessory to the killing of William Maddox. Sentence 15 years federal custody. Drummond Land Company dissolved. Assets directed toward partial restitution of identified victims. Marshall Eves guilty on 6 counts. He departed the territory and did not return. Ray Sutter, suspended sentence. Full cooperation. Retained at the land office under federal judicial oversight, with the condition that he spend the next 3 years using his knowledge of what had been done to help methodically undo it. Clara read the letter at the clinic table, alone in the late afternoon. She set it down and looked out the window at the mountains. She thought about Pete Harker sleeping, about Nora laughing at something Danny said in the yard, about Gray Horse watching the creek run without anyone trying to change its direction. She picked up her father's bag and set it on the examination table. She opened it. She looked at the initials on the leather. Worn now, the stitching soft with years. E. Whitfield, D. She took out the prescription notebook with his initials on the cover and opened it to a fresh page and wrote her own name below his, Dr. Clara Whitfield. Below that, Redemption Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1,883. She closed the notebook. She put it back in the bag. It was the first time the bag had ever held both their names. Cole came that evening. He had heard about the verdict through Eli. He found her at the table with the letter in front of her, and he sat across from her without explaining himself, because by now he didn't need to. They were quiet for a while, the good kind of quiet. Then Cole said what he had been holding since the mountain, since the shoulder, since the night in Agnes's barn, when he had told her the truth about Hank Corbin, and she had answered him with accuracy instead of comfort. I have a piece of ground to the west, 40 acres, good water, good grade. I've been meaning to build on it for 5 years. He looked at her. I didn't have a good enough reason before. Clara looked at him. What are you asking me, Cole? I'm telling you there's a reason for you to stay, if you need one, and if you don't need one. I'm saying I'd like you to stay anyway. His voice was level. No performance in it. Just the plain shape of what was true, she said. I got a letter from Denver last week. A real hospital. Double the pay. They'd call me a doctor from the first day. I know I didn't answer it. He waited. Because Gray Horse told me something in the summer. That good land needs people who choose it because they want to be there, not because they have nowhere else to go. She looked at him. I'm staying because I want to be here, not for you. But I want you to know that you're one of the reasons I want to be here. She was not asking him to carry her decision. She was telling him the truth of it, which was more generous than that. Cole nodded. Slow. That 40 acres has good soil, he said. Room enough for a house and a clinic both, if a person wanted that kind of thing. That's something we could talk about. Clara said, yes, he said. It is. In the morning, Redemption Creek woke up the way it always did, which was the same as always and also not the same at all. James Sung's bakery opened at 6. Clara could smell the bread from the boarding house before she was fully dressed. Danny Bright was running the field road in the early light, a habit Nora had started him on with the simple logic that healthy lungs made a longer life. And Danny had decided this was worth getting up for. Spotted elk led horses toward the north pasture. Hank Corbin was in his east field with his eldest boy, working the fence line that no one was going to cut tonight. Clara stood outside the clinic in the early light with her father's bag over her shoulder. Cole appeared from the direction of the bakery with 2 cups of coffee. He stood beside her and looked out at the street without explaining his presence, which didn't need explaining. You're early, she said. I'm usually late. What changed? He drank his coffee. He looked west toward the Wind River Range, the peaks going gold with the first of the morning sun, the same mountains that had been there before any of this and would be there long after. He didn't answer in words. Clara, who had spent a summer learning to read what this man said in the space around his words, understood. She looked at the mountains, too. There were things she had brought from Boston that hadn't changed. The method, the knowledge, the understanding that a patient was a partner in their own care and not a subject to be acted upon. And there were things she had learned here that Boston could never have given her. That justice doesn't start in a courtroom. It starts the moment someone stops pretending the wrong isn't happening. That trusting a person after you've been hurt isn't weakness. It's the most specific kind of courage available. It looks like a woman on a mountain, in pain, saying 3 words to a man whose hands she has just decided to believe in. That a valley with hard soil and good people and years of work still ahead is exactly the kind of place worth building something in. And that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is stay. She picked up her father's bag and walked inside to open the clinic. The morning was just beginning. The characters, settings, and events portrayed in this story are entirely fictional. While certain themes may echo real-life experiences, they are shaped by creative interpretation. The author does not intend to represent or depict any specific individual, organization, or historical event. And so, as the dust settles over Redemption Creek and the voices that once filled its streets begin to fade into memory, what remains is not just a story of conflict between men of power and those who stood against them, but a deeper reflection on what it means to live with integrity in a world that often rewards silence more than truth. This is not just the end of Clara Whitfield's journey, nor the end of Cole Maddox's reckoning, nor even the end of Drummond S.'s shadow over the valley. It is, instead, the beginning of understanding what all of it meant. Because every decision made in this valley carried weight far beyond its borders. Every act of courage, every moment of hesitation, every choice to speak or remain silent became part of a larger moral geography that defined not just who survived, but who remained human while surviving. Clara did not come to Redemption Creek as a hero. She came as a physician trained to observe, to diagnose, to treat what could be treated, and to document what could not be ignored. But what she discovered was that some illnesses are not confined to the body. Some diseases live in systems, in contracts written in fine print, in ledgers hidden in mountain cabins, in authority that answers only to itself. And in those places, medicine alone is not enough. It requires courage. It requires witness. It requires the willingness to stand in front of power and say, without hesitation, that every life, whether crow, Chinese settler, farmer, or child, carries equal weight in the scale of justice. The lesson of Clara's journey is not that she was unafraid, but that she chose to act despite fear, despite uncertainty, and despite the very real understanding that truth, once spoken, often comes with consequences. She teaches us that professionalism without morality is simply obedience, and that expertise without conscience can become another tool of control if it is not guided by compassion. Cole Maddox's path reminds us of something equally important, and perhaps even more painful, that proximity to injustice is not the same as resistance to it. For much of his life, Cole existed in the uncomfortable space between awareness and action, between knowing what was wrong and fearing the cost of confronting it. And yet, what makes his transformation meaningful is not that he was always right, but that he finally chose to stop being complicit in silence. His story is not one of perfection, but of responsibility reclaimed slowly, painfully, and without guarantees of forgiveness. In him we see the truth that redemption is not a single moment of clarity, but a series of decisions made when it would have been easier not to act at all. And then there is Drummond, a man who never saw himself as a villain, who believed instead that order justified outcome, and that efficiency could excuse moral compromise. His worldview is perhaps the most dangerous lesson of all, because it reflects how easily systems of control can be rationalized when measured only in profit, stability, or growth. He did not believe he was destroying lives. He believed he was managing resources. And that is precisely where the tragedy lies. Because when human beings become entries in a ledger, justice becomes negotiable, and suffering becomes invisible. But what ultimately dismantles that invisibility is not force alone, it is record, testimony, persistence, and the refusal of ordinary people to accept that injustice is simply how things are. Agnes Bright, Pete Harker, James Sung, Nora Maddox, Eli Cobb, and others who stepped forward each represent a different kind of courage, not the courage of confrontation, but the courage of acknowledgement.